I'm going to call this meeting to order. It's a regularly scheduled meeting of the Transportation Public Works Committee. This day, February 3rd, 2015. I'm Councilmember Reich. I'll be chairing the committee, and I'm joined by members of the committee, Councilmember Glidden, Councilmember Palmisano, Councilmember Bender, and Councilmember Gordon, and Councilmember Yang is on his way, and will be a full committee. We have 11 items today, 10 of which are on the consent agenda, and one is a discussion item. I will go through the consent items, and members can pull anything for discussion or further consideration if they wish. Item 1 is the 34th Avenue South, 43rd Street East resurfacing project, and that's a resolution designating the location for the improvements, receiving the cost estimate of $119,904, and directing the city engineer to prepare assessments against those benefited properties. And that public hearing will be set April 7th, 2015. Item 2 is the 38th Street East reconstruction project layout, and that's to approve the layout for the project on 38th Street between Hiawatha and Minneapolis, and authorize negotiation with private property owners to acquire easements and additional right-of-ways if necessary. Item 3 is a parking restriction, approving a resolution or the installation of parking restrictions on Minnehaha Avenue between 46th Street and Nawadaha Boulevard to meet state aid rules. Item 4 is the Minnehaha Avenue Reconstruction Cooperative Agreement parking restrictions, and that's an agreement with Hennepin County for the reconstruction of Minnehaha Avenue, and approving resolution ordering the installation of parking and stopping restrictions on Minnehaha Avenue between Lake Street and 46th Street East to meet state aid rules. That will be referred to the Ways and Means Committee. Item 5 is the Water Main Work Cooperative Agreement, and authorize execution of that agreement with Hennepin County for proposed improvements to support the system of an existing city-owned water main in conjunction with county project renovation on Franklin Avenue Bridge. The estimated cost for this activity is $826,200, and funding is available in the Water Distribution Capital Budget. This will be referred to Ways and Means. Item 6 is authorizing acceptance of 3 county public spaces for public recycling grants to be used for the purchase of public sidewalk recycling containers as follows, and increasing the appropriation accordingly. Solid waste recycling adopt a recycling container pilot project, $14,000. 54th and Lindale Special Service District, $7,000. West Broadway Improvement Special Service District, $10,000. Those items referred to Ways and Means Committee. Item 7 is the 10th Avenue Storm Tunnel Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Project. Authorize increase in the contract with Lomedi & Sons Incorporated by $52,128.40 for the revised contract total of $2,873,953.40 for construction change order associated with the conditions prior to beginning the original contract work. Funding is available in the Storm Drains and Tunnels Rehabilitation Program, also referred to Ways and Means Committee. Item 8 is the Sable Bridge ownership, authorizing execution of an agreement to transfer ownership of the Martins Olaf Sable pedestrian and bicycle bridge over Hiawatha Avenue from Hennepin County to the City of Minneapolis, canceling cost share agreements related to the diaphragm plate failure, cooperative forensics engineering funding agreement, and canceling cooperative agreement to share the cost of the remaining work associated with the easement and repair the bridge. That will be referred to Ways and Means. Item 9 is receiving and filing the 2015 paving program report. That's included in your packet. Item 10 is accepting some bids, including the TZAC Concrete Incorporated for estimated expenditures of $1,396,100 for the construction of 88 pedestrian intersection ramps through December 31st, 2015, and accepting the low bids of ADS LLC for an estimated expenditure of $691,728.85 for the closed circuit inspection of the city storm drain system. That'll be referred to Ways and Means. Those are the 10 items. Does anyone wish to pull them? Seeing none, I will move all items as stated. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. Those carry. And we can now move to our discussion item, which is the tree failure study report. Director Hamilton.
Mr. Chair, Mike Kennedy will introduce this item. We also are joined by the Park Board and the gentleman who performed the study.
Very good. Good morning, Mr. Kennedy.
Morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Mike Kennedy, I'm the Director of Transportation Maintenance and Repair for Minneapolis Public Works. Today, our subject is to report on the findings of the tree failure study conducted by the University of Minnesota following the windstorms in June of 2013. With me today is Gary Johnson, a professor at the University of Minnesota who was the lead investigator on the report, I will give a brief introduction here, and then Gary will come up and present the report findings to you. Then I'll follow up with a little bit of discussion, a brief discussion on some of the steps that Public Works has been taking since this study came out in the last year. Also, we have Ralph Sievert, the Chief Forester from Minneapolis Park and Rec Board, here to answer any questions that you might have, and his team as well. So, on June 21, 2013, severe windstorms that began west of the Twin Cities moved eastward into Minneapolis in the early evening. Private and public boulevard tree damage caused by the storm was quite extensive. Damaged trees interrupted above-ground electrical services. Many streets, sidewalks, and alleys were blocked for several days. Anecdotal evidence suggested a higher than normal frequency of total tree failures involving boulevard trees in Minneapolis. These tree failure incidents, called wind throws in forestry terminology, are where trees are uprooted or partially tipped. Observations suggested these failures may have been related to pre-existing factors, such as recent sidewalk or street improvement activities that severed tree root systems in the process. The University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources Urban Forestry Outreach Research and Extension Lab was contracted by the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board Forestry Department to fully investigate this phenomenon. The investigation sought to determine that what, if any, pre-existing factors may have contributed to the rate of tree failures during this wind loading event. Funding for the study came from the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board and the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization. With that, I'll bring up Gary Johnson, and he can go through his report for you.
Mr. Chair, council members, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
And I'm going to do my best to make this interesting for you all. The opportunity to study something like this is pretty rare and unpredictable. Most research studies we can set up, observe, collect data, analyze. This is, we wait for storms to hit. And because of that, there's actually a dearth of information on the type of storm damage that we're going to discuss this morning because of this waiting, not knowing when the storm's going to strike. So this in particular was from, as Mike stated, 2013, that storm, one of the storms that hit Minnesota that summer. And I'd like to start off with trees and winds collide everywhere. The kind of flippant reaction you get from some people is like, well, the reason why trees go down is because wind. And my equally flippant response is then, why don't all trees go down? If it's wind, then everything should go down, if that's strictly it. And this study gave us a rare opportunity to look at this typical scene. So I understand why people would say, well, it's because of the wind. But if you look at this scene, by the way, which was in Minneapolis, it looks pretty destructive, but there are only 2 trees down. There are only 2 trees damaged. And this is fairly typical for storms. It's the weaklings, or the ones, you know, if we have a catastrophic wind event like a tornado, nothing survives. Silos, buildings don't survive. But in these regular storms that are becoming even more regular, if you've been watching the state climatology reports, that we're up by 37% in these high volume rain events and wind events over the last 3 decades. So I think that was kind of the critical reason for the study is then why don't all trees fail? And if you look at a storm failure triangle, there are 3 elements to look at or to analyze in an event like this. One is the loading event itself, and we're going to focus on the wind loading event. The second is the site characteristics, and we're focusing on boulevards. And then third is the tree variable, and we looked at a lot of different variables with the trees, including the size, et cetera. So with wind loading events, I think what the general public doesn't understand is that a thunderstorm can be more outrageous than an EF0 tornado. It has higher wind velocity. So I think there's almost a sense of complacency. It's like, don't worry, it's just a thunderstorm coming along. But thunderstorms can be clocked at 80 miles per hour. And that's what hit Minneapolis that day. That, you know, it didn't even reach 70 miles per hour. So it's in that category, but that is still more powerful than an EF0 tornado. So these wind loading events are unpredictable, and they can cause a lot of damage. The site characteristics, the degree of friction, which is just a fancy word for, is there anything to slow the wind down? Buildings, other trees, topography, et cetera. A limited root plate, this is why we focused on boulevards in particular, because that's a good example of a limited amount of space that roots can actually grow in. So they don't have normal root plates, a normal distribution of roots to keep them vertical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll go over those site characteristics, and then the tree itself. Now, trees are all different. They're dynamic systems. They're a dynamic system basically perched on a static infrastructure. The streets don't change, the soil's pretty much the same. It's the tree that is so dynamic. And then if you look at the variables, it's intuitive. How big is it? How much wind sail does it have, et cetera? Any structural weaknesses. And that's how we analyze. And we've been, when I say we, it's collectively this team I've been working with since 1994. We were kind of directed at that point by the state tree board to investigate why trees fail in storms. And quite honestly, there's a lot of information on why trees fail above the ground. When they break at stems or branches break off, very, very little information when there's total tree failure. So as you look at the data in here, the storms that day, and there were 2 of them, were worse in western Minnesota and Hutchinson, et cetera, than they were here, but they still caused a considerable amount of damage. And if you were one of the unlucky people that lost your power that day, there were a lot of people. The losses in terms of electrical service and repair, et cetera, it was just amazing for a storm like this. 2 relatively tolerable windstorms that came along that caused that much damage. Well, as Mike said, we were already collecting data at this point in other communities during the storm, quite honestly. And one of the things that we were noticing is like there seemed to be an extraordinary lean toward the number of trees going down in boulevards as opposed to lawns and parks, et cetera. And the other thing we noticed that seemed to be associated with some fresh sidewalk repair. And fresh is kind of a relative thing, but you could tell it was relatively fresh because the color of the concrete was so much brighter. It's kind of anecdotal. Well, we then had this opportunity to study this in much more detail, thanks to the park board, to the watershed district, to the university too. And one of the things that I wanted to be very conscientious about is to remain as unbiased as possible on this. So I contracted with the University of Minnesota Statistics Department to design the study. So I told them what we wanted to study. They laid out the study completely. And then we followed their directives, turned the data over to them, they analyzed it, and that's the results of the study today. Also, to remove as much bias as possible, collectively, there were probably 15 people trained by us that were collecting data. So it was not one person going out, because there is that danger. You start seeing what you want to see. And when you have the conscientiousness of 15 people out there, you kind of get caught if you start, showing any bias whatsoever. So we did everything we could, because this is such a unique study. There's only been one study in the world that's published that's similar to this, and that was in Australia. And as you're going to see with this, we ended up studying a total of, I think it was 3,076 trees. We looked at every single tree in the boulevards in the path of the storm. And as long as that Block Street segment had at least more than one tree that went down, we studied every single tree there. And that's what made this so unique and so robust. Excuse me, there were a total of 67 trees that were tipped in that. So again, we look back at why don't all trees tip? There were 3,073 trees. Why didn't only 367 trees tip? And that's really what piques your curiosity. There's got to be a weak link in there, an Achilles heel. So I'm sure you all remember the path of the storm, and it essentially went from the northwest corner to the southeast corner of Minneapolis, and it hit Richfield, St. Paul, et cetera. And so this is where we focused the study. And in particular, when we talked about tipped trees, there are 2 categories of tipped. One is that the stump tipped greater than 50% of the roots out of the ground, and the other one was less than 50%. Quite honestly, they're both gone. You don't leave partially tipped trees. But this is kind of a technical term used to evaluate tree losses, and that's why we use this to be consistent with federal terminology on this. Excuse me. So the block street segments then were defined as your typical block length, the street or the trees on both sides of the street in the boulevard. And I think I have a graphic here. Yeah, this would explain it a little bit better. So when you look down this typical block street, we looked at the boulevard trees on both sides. And what we were trying to do to keep this as unbiased as possible is we literally went with block street segments that were running north-south. So we would kind of avoid the impact valleys and blunt force winds, et cetera, just to try to even this out as much as possible. And we still came up with over 3,000 trees. These are the variables we studied on this. And I learned a long, long time ago not to second guess or predict what variables are going to end up being influential or important in the end. So we just collect as much information as we can. The information collected started in August. It was completed in March. So it was kind of and if you're thinking, wasn't there a lot of snow in the sidewalks? Yep. There was a lot of shoveling. There were flamethrowers to melt snow and ice so we could see different things. But this is the data we collected, and a lot of this is lab data too, with the soil analysis. What we're particularly interested in is documenting sidewalk replacement or curb replacement, and sidewalk also included the carriage paths too. So had they been replaced or repaired within the last 5 years? Why did I pick 5 years? Completely arbitrary, completely. And in retrospect, I'm glad that I did because it took so long to get all this information. It was an onerous task. And if you look at the lower right photo, in some cases, there was actually driveway pad replacements in there too. And then the measurements from the replacement to the root plate, most of the time, I'd say at least half the time, we were lucky enough to find the date stamped in the concrete so we knew when it was poured or replaced. But the other half of the time we didn't. And so we spent a lot of time in the archives in Minneapolis, and thanks to all the different, in the end you'll see the thank you list, all the people that were kind enough to help us go through these files to find this exact data. When was the concrete, when was the sidewalk repaired? Without that, I wouldn't be here today. I would not feel comfortable enough today to give you the information that we had. So, and we also recorded if there was any damage subsequent to the tree failure to the sidewalks or curbs, because I'm also interested in how much does it cost a community when a tree leans or partially leans too. So this data was collected, et cetera. And sometimes it was bad, most of the time not that big of a deal. So as you probably know by now, the major finding was having the sidewalks replaced was the Achilles heel for these tips. This was the most critical thing. And if you looked at a tree that was not near a sidewalk pad replacement versus one that was, there was a 2.24 times greater chance, greater risk of failure for the one near the sidewalk replacement. And if you think about this, it makes sense. Why was that sidewalk pad replaced? Because the tree's roots or the trunk of the tree had lifted it and caused a trip hazard, something unacceptable. So the sidewalk concrete was removed, the tree roots were cut, a new sidewalk pad was replaced, and within 5 years we had this windstorm that caused this type of damage. So it did make sense. One of the things that we did find out was that curb replacement did not have a significant impact. So it was really sidewalk pad replacement. We also looked for areas where there had been complete reconstructions, new water lines, new sidewalks, electric lines, whole new streets, nothing significant. So it was these individual repair jobs that really caused this weakness in here and more than doubled the chance that trees would fail. So we would have situations like this where the concrete pads had been replaced within the last 5 years because of the damage that the tree roots had caused on this. Now looking at species, and again, this is intuitive, and if you're sitting there thinking like, good grief, does this man get paid to do this kind of intuitive stuff. Well, that's the only time when intuitive things really start becoming reality, is when you get enough data to support that. And so this is one of those intuitive things that big trees are going to fall faster than smaller trees. And larger trunk trees are going to fall faster. Taller trees, denser trees, ones that have a wind sail of a sailboat or a brick building are going to catch more of this wind, resist it more, and they're going to be more likely to fail. So that doubled the chance too. So we have this list of species. There were over 30 different tree species in the study, but there were only about 4 or 5 of them that really showed their weakness. And what did they have in common? They're big. And so an ash tree, when it's mature, is a big tree. An ash tree, when it's been planted within the last 5 years, is a small tree. And so it was actually, what was the category of tree? Large tree category, ash. What was its actual age? Big. So smaller trees, no big deal. Big trees, big deal. So now we have the data to support that. And so little leaf lindens, and if you're familiar with this tree, they literally have the wind resistance of a brick wall. If a blue spruce could become deciduous, it would be a little leaf linden. And so they catch a lot more wind than the average tree does, and they're big too. And then green ash, poor green ash just gets hammered left and right. Maples and elms. Now, if you're thinking, well, this makes sense, because maybe little leaf lindens are the most common tree. They're not. They're not. Maples are the most common, ash, and then you start going down to the others. So it's not the most commonly planted tree. And then DBH, DBH is the measurement of the trunk diameter at 4.5 feet above ground. So that goes back to what I was saying, that these are not only large tree category trees, but they're actually mature, and they actually are big at that point instead of a new 12-foot tall green ash being planted. These are mature trees. So DBH then was significant, again, when sidewalk repair had been done. And then boulevard width. Boulevard width was significantly related to it, but again, only when the sidewalk repair was done. So as you go through this data, you see that common thread, which is sidewalk replacement. And it's not that concrete is bad, it's just, why is the concrete being replaced? Because the tree roots or the tree trunk had come in conflict. It had to be removed at that point, the tree roots or the tree trunk, to pour new concrete. This is traditional repair. So that is the common thread in there. Now when you couple it with a skinny little boulevard, i.e. less than 8 feet wide, you have a much higher frequency of failure. Oddly, of all this research, that's one piece of research that has about 4 decades of previous research behind it. And this was University of Wisconsin, first published it in University of Illinois, that boulevards less than 10 feet wide are more at risk for construction damage, decline to construction damage, and then failure in windstorms too. So a little bit of previous research backing that up. So boulevard width, yes, but only when the sidewalks were repaired. You may be able to breathe a collective sigh of relief on the soil properties, because none of them were significant. So that's one thing you don't have to worry about. The bad part is I spent a ton of money on these lab tests. Soil tests are extremely expensive. And in the end, to find out that, no, nothing mattered, except soil compaction at 6-inch depth. And really, the only time, again, that it made a huge difference was when the sidewalks had been replaced. So we keep going back to that point, which kind of makes it easier for the take-home recommendations. Cutting roots jeopardizes stability. Whenever possible, consult with foresters. This is what we're trained to do. All of us are trained in risk assessment. And risk assessment, whether it's highways or curbs or streetlights or trees, it's a very methodical process, and it's got a lot of history and technology behind it. Like Pontiac's, wider is better, at least for boulevards whenever you can. And then larger trees need larger boulevards or larger root plates. And there are ways of playing around with that a little bit to accommodate that. So an acknowledgement of the funding, which you've seen, and more importantly, an acknowledgement of all the partners, the people that were part of this. This is a very unique study with a lot of partners, a lot of people looking at each other, scratching their heads. Why are you here? What are you looking for? And throughout the process, it's like, I don't know what I'm finding. I don't even know for sure what I'm looking for. That's why I'm looking at everything. But in the end, it was an outstanding study. I do want to mention as a side note, I've presented this research to conferences in the last 12 months from Utah to Massachusetts. So nothing west of Utah. I don't know why. They haven't invited me. But this has helped a lot of communities. Most recently, last week in Omaha. So this was a very big conference that focused on this kind of stuff. And this is really valuable, unique information to help communities out in their long-range comp planning. So thank you very much for inviting me today.
Very good. Any questions? Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate this this report. Lots of trees in my part of the city went down because of the storm, and people were wondering and curious about this. I have one question in terms of the sidewalk replacement. Did you do any kind of inspection of the tree roots to see if they'd been ground or cut off, or were you just assuming they must have been?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Gordon, yes. And actually what we did was, this is kind of sad, but we have a photo log of everything. So it's kind of like your family photo book. Ours is tree roots. And so, yes, we could see that they had been cut, they had been severed, very nice, clean. I think one of the unusual things that you find out about this kind of study is you can't predict how roots regenerate or how fast they're going to regenerate. And so that's why we photo document everything, and we have it up next to a screen so we know the scale. You know, it's like a grid board, so we can understand scale. We can see the severed roots, et cetera. So in answer to your question, yes, they had been cut, was documented, every single one of them. Thanks.
Okay, well, that seems like a pretty striking piece of evidence that if we're grinding and cutting the roots when we replace the sidewalks, we increase, and I don't remember the statistic, but the
2.24 times.
Yeah, the tree's going to fall over in a storm.
Yep. And I think that it also emphasizes, again, these little insidious things that happen. You know, grinding and cutting roots sounds so dramatic. Putting in a cable TV cable, a gas line or something, just cutting a 4-inch, it doesn't matter if you go in with a backhoe or if you go in with a scalpel. If you cut the roots of the tree, you've cut the roots of the tree. It's less stable. So I think with this study, it seemed a little bit more gross, but it's no different than the other activities that reduce the stability of a tree. What was unusual about this is having this luxury of time and freedom to investigate and document that we had on here. So that's why you know, this is such striking evidence and information.
Thank you.
Councilmember Glidden.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, wow, I have to say this was a really, really striking report. I don't know that it's just the significance of the sidewalk work as compared to being more significant, the boulevard width and some other elements, if I'm reading that right?
Yes.
Because I think there was a lot of speculation as we went through the aftermath of the storm about how the boulevard width, how significant that was compared to other elements. You know, and so this report wasn't planned to have comments by city staff, so I don't know if Mr. Kennedy or Ms. Hamilton have thought through kind of what their recommendations are, but it seems to me just refining through your study what was the cause of so many trees really gives us a good ability to maybe think differently about our practices and how they can affect tree strength into the future. The other thing I was thinking about is the city is not the only entity that works in the boulevard or does work on the sidewalks. So often we have entities, and I'm thinking of a particular example, but this is not the only entity that works in that space. Centerpoint was doing some required work on the gas lines, and we actually had some complaints from neighbors who saw how they were cutting tree roots. And then we did some work together with staff to work on recommendations for how they could have a lesser impact. But it seems to me this report affects not just our city operations, but potentially how we set parameters and requirements for those permitted bodies that do work in the sidewalk area, in the boulevard area, that may touch city trees. Ms. Hamilton?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Glidden, Mike Kennedy is in fact prepared to step up and share with you. We took the results of this study very seriously, obviously a lot of interesting things. And so Mike has been working internally with Public Works staff as well as the Park Board to figure out what can we do and how can we utilize these results. So when you're ready, he can certainly step up and share that information with you.
If I may say one more thing, Mr. Chair and council members, trained as a scientist, I'm trained not to believe one thing. Actually, that's my human nature. I pretty much doubt everything that's ever said to me. But I'm trained also not to believe solely in one research study, or even solely in 2 research studies, or 3. When you start getting an accumulated body of evidence, then you become more comfortable. That's the first thing. And this sounds terrible, but one of the things that has resulted from this is I have a memorandum of understanding with St. Cloud, with a number of cities in the state that if storms come this year, following year, we can duplicate the study in that community. We have permission to do that. The more evidence like this that we can collect, then the more comfortable we can be with it. So that's the first thing. It's like, this is a really good study, very, very good evidence from it, but it's one study here. And just keep that in perspective. The second thing is, it's very easy to find fault. It's very difficult to find solutions sometimes. And most of the solutions associated with this are not solutions that can happen tomorrow. It's planning. It really is a matter of planning. And like so much with planning, a lot of it is public perception, very slowly getting this information out to people, all the partners in here. So it is like a lifelong process, but it's very good information.
Councilmember Gordon? or Councilmember Yang, Gordon's done, and then Councilmember Palmisano. And I guess after the query, we can engage other staff people as needed. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question to you, Professor Johnson, is, you've gone through all these different species, and I'm wondering, is there a more perfect tree that we should be planting?
No. Your perfect tree is a tree that gives you canopy. I don't know of anybody that sits in the shade of a tree trunk. I don't know of any tree trunk that helps, moderate or slow down rainfall so it doesn't all end up in the stormwater system, and that it's canopy, canopy, canopy. So your perfect tree is a large tree with a large canopy. The trick is finding the perfect space for it.
Okay.
That's the trick. And or, substituting sidewalk paths. Perhaps it'll be a redesign of the architecture of sidewalks, where sidewalks in certain areas start at the curb line rather than leave a 4 or 6 or 8 foot wide boulevard. And this has largely been the path of Duluth. They have gone to, when they've reconstructed, a lot of they've eliminated boulevards. Basically, they start the sidewalk at the curb and they use the right-of-way area for planting trees. That's just one alternative. So that's my long-winded way of saying, no, there is no perfect tree. It's the placement of it that you try to get perfect.
Okay, thank you, Professor Johnson. And Mr. Chair, I just wanted to ask this generally, but probably more specifically to the staff, is, knowing what we know now with this study, does this change the way we go about doing sidewalk repairs?
I think that's, I think we can explore that and talk to staff even presently and then ongoing as well. So, thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think
Council Vice President Glenn mostly kind of answered my question and gave that comment, but I'm curious, part of your presentation talked about there was, what do you suspect could be the difference with curb replacement versus sidewalk replacement? And I think this might get more into our public works staff, because I know there's a different process for those things, but it occurs to me that they're mostly equidistant from each, and like you said, when you make a cut, it doesn't matter if you're going in with a backhoe or a scalpel in terms of what you're removing. But I just wonder, what kinds of things do we do with curb replacement versus sidewalk that makes sidewalk work more precarious for the urban canopy?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, I think in this case, it was probably more of a situation of there were so few curb replacements done within the last 5 years in the path of the storm. But I go back to, since I've been working on this since 1994, I work in a lot of communities. And generally speaking, it's the difference between routes running parallel to the activity versus perpendicular. So with sidewalk replacements, the routes are running perpendicular to the sidewalk. They're severed so the sidewalk can be replaced. With curbs, roots hit curbs. Rarely do they ever go under the curb. They usually, roots are very, very mellow. They hit a curb, and rather than confront it, they just follow the path of the curb. So unless you're actually widening the street, most of the time the curb is removed and a new curb is put in, and very little damage is done to those roots that are almost stacked up to the interior of the curb because they're running parallel. So that's probably the biggest reason. And this was a confirmation of it, although I couldn't say statistically significant because there were so few cases where the curb had been replaced. Good question, though.
Good. Thank you. And this study is obviously very comprehensive, and to your earlier point, not only is it interesting, it's also very edifying as well, but definitely interesting. And I think the effort and the expenses that you highlighted, we want to invest in knowing how to best manage. We want to have a data-driven approach, and so this work is very impressive indeed, and clearly unique. I mean, if it's Australia, that's the only other body that's out there. I'm sure they have other variables like koala bear chewing a foliage or something that we don't have to factor in. But this is really important. I'm glad it's something that we can build off of. In terms of species, were there any species that just didn't seem to fall down at all, and no matter what their size were? This is just completely anecdotal, but there's a row of hackberries several blocks where I live, and they full canopy. They've been around for a long time, and not one has dropped. Is there some kind of root pattern that they just adapt better to urban conditions? Or is that a variable that would need to be explored more vertically in another study?
Mr. Chair, that's a really good question. And it also points out the dynamic situation these trees are growing in. If the soil is not a compacted soil, compacted to the point where roots can't penetrate, hackberry roots do go deeper. So they would be more stable because they would be less dependent upon those roots right near the surface. So yes, what's interesting about hackberry, I'm a tree geek. So what's interesting to me about hackberries is when hackberries cause damage to sidewalks, most of the time it's not from the roots, it's from the trunk flare. So at the base of the tree where it spreads out, if they're in very narrow boulevard, or if they're planted too close to pavement, they will damage the concrete, but it's not from the roots. It's from the base of the trunk where it tapers out, which gives the tree stability. So there are some unusual growth habits with hackberry. It's kind of this randomness of the soil in the city too, because we've studied some soils where, I'm 185 pounds and I have to jump up and down on the probe just to get it through the soil. And then we'll go a block later and it's beautiful sandy loam. And it's completely unpredictable. And I think that's why it seems that the trees are unpredictable too. But if you had to look at a species that survives better, it's any small tree. Just less wind resistance. But they don't give you the canopy that you enjoy. It's a problem.
Thank you. I think there were some queries that suggested some interface with other staff folks. So I know we have our public works, and of course, we have our jurisdictional partners who do most of the care of the trees. And so if anyone felt appropriate to the questions that have arisen so far.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was very interesting. I'll just talk a little bit about what Public Works has done since the release of the report and looking at it. One of the things that we did was we reviewed the 2004 urban forest policy that was commissioned and completed back in 2004, a collaboration with the Minneapolis Tree Advisory Committee, the Public Works, and Forestry, to look at design conditions and considerations for the urban forest. We found that a lot of the recommendations that came out of this report were already mentioned there and already sort of being done. And in fact, now Public Works and Forestry folks are getting together to go through the policy and update it based on the findings of this current report and see if there's more that we can do and update it. But like I said, there are a lot of things that we were already doing. One of the things that the Minneapolis Tree Advisory Committee recommended was the creation of a person, a staff member who could focus on these issues. And they advocated for the creation of a Forestry Preservation Coordinator, an FPC, on behalf of the Park Board that could be specialize in working with us and any other parties that are doing construction and maintenance work around the trees to help prevent any of these kind of problems. Look at design considerations, maintenance considerations, things like that. They did establish or appoint an interim FPC last summer, and we worked very, very closely with that person, started to establish a rapport and a relationship with them, having them come out whenever we when we recognize that we may have issues, whether it be a curb and gutter replacement, a construction project, or sidewalk conditions, as well as utilities. So we've reestablished that. We held a field meeting, as Councilmember Glidden mentioned. There was a meeting with CenterPoint Energy, with Park Board staff, CenterPoint, their contractor, and Public Works staff, to get an understanding of how we can better coordinate work and complete work when utilities are potentially going to be affecting boulevard trees. Some of the things that have come out of that is even a stronger relationship of getting the Forestry Prevention Coordinator involved with those things. They are going to be, as permits, utility permits come through, we're going to be, anytime we have a tree that's going to be affected over 2 inches in diameter, we're going to get that information over to the FPC for their review, and so they'll be aware of it and can make recommendations. We have our capital project task force that will have the same FPC be much more involved in. We have, that's a design plan review that they will come and be involved with the review of that and make recommendations. We discussed alternative excavation techniques in the field. This was something that was already mentioned in the 2004 urban forest policy, but there's new technology and new things, and one of the things they talked about was using some technology called a hydro excavator, which is much less invasive, much less damaging to roots, and will aid in the not needing to sever roots and be able to install utilities underground with minimal effect to the trees. Again, we started to work with the FPC in our design force. There's a lot of recommendations about boulevard widths and things like that. Whenever there's an opportunity to do that, our design folks will be in looking at those opportunities to get wider boulevards, plant the appropriate trees when we can't get wider boulevards, and just be much more in tune with the process. So Public Works will continue to collaborate with the Forestry, Park Board Forestry, to find ways to minimize the effect of construction and maintenance activities and increase tree resistance to storm damage from wind loading. If you have any questions about trees themselves and a lot of the Park Board's processes and work so far, Ralph Seifert is here to answer questions, and I can answer any questions you have. Otherwise, our recommendation today is to receive and file this report, and we're here to answer any questions.
Councilmember Gordon, and then I would actually, after that, whatever query you have, Mr. Sievert, if you could just come up and approach. You know, we always look to Park and Rec as our caretakers of the trees themselves, and so any comments or insights per the findings would be helpful for today's conversation, if you'd be willing. But Councilmember Gordon or Mr. Sievert.
We could wait, yeah.
Welcome.
Yes, good morning, council members. I think one of the things that Mike alluded to, and Gary also, is that in addition to the work around sidewalks, there are a lot of, let's call them external factors that affect trees. So in addition to what Public Works does, there's things that CenterPoint Energy does, there's things that XL Energy does, there's things that our own park board, you know, playground redevelopment, paths, all those sorts of things. So there's many different, the county, the state, you know, there's all different sorts of agencies that have activities that go on that affect trees. And I think that the benefit we've seen out of this recommendation, where we took both the Tree Commission's advice and the advice that Gary put into the report about putting a position in place, this Forestry Preservation Coordinator. I think that's what's really, just in a short amount of time, shown a lot of results, which Mike alluded to. A lot of the just the interaction that that person has been able to have with all these activities that are going on with trees. And we only see that growing. The fact that he's only been doing it since like, I think June. We just see that improving. And we're very fortunate because the individual that's in this position uniquely came to us maybe like say 7 years ago, but he previously had worked for the city of Milwaukee and was very intimately involved in this exact same work with the person in Milwaukee who has been doing it for decades. So he was kind of already sort of well-trained in a lot of the work that's involved in preserving trees. And the other part too is he's already been able to, because we also look at the idea that if you can't preserve a tree, then we do want to make sure we get the tree removed before the tree falls. And I think that's another important part of it. And he's been able to make that determination in the field in some cases where based on the situation, you know, there's a tree that might have to be sacrificed in order for the safety and the elimination of all the hazards that come with a tree falling. So, so it's great to kind of have someone already kind of doing some of that, and eventually getting that person in a full-time position so we can kind of just keep growing on that regard.
Thank you very much. And then I'll go to Councilmember Gordon, but real quick, Assistant Director Hamilton, it seems like we have an ongoing process here of which this is not an endpoint. And so what, in terms of the activity that's taking place with both the jurisdictional partners, the other outside utility partners, and then of course our relevant commissions, being both the pedestrian realm as well as our tree advisory. And so what's the outcome after we do the receive and file, and what ongoing products and policy directives that come out of this work as we move forward, and timelines?
Yes, Chairman Reich. I think as Mike highlighted, he and his team we have staff who are frequently engaged with Minneapolis Park Board, and we are reviewing our policies and looking at how we can do this work better. We are calling the forestry coordinator to come in and confer with us in the field and in our plan review. So I would say this is just an ongoing relationship where we are trying to improve our practices and try and figure out how we can cause less damage to trees. One of the things I think we can note is there's lots of trade-offs here. As you all know, there's always a lot of debate about how we spend every foot in the right-of-way. And so while an 8-foot boulevard is ideal, absolutely, we know that sometimes that wider boulevard can mean we can't get parking, or we can't get a bike lane in, or we can't get other things. So I think the knowledge base is something we're going to continue to try and spread and utilize throughout Public Works. And it comes down to the point-by-point decision we make on whether it's in the field or in a particular design. So I really see this as ongoing knowledge that Public Works is going to continue to use and incorporate into our practices.
So thank you for that. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I guess I had a couple questions. I'm also interested in staff direction so we can get this back to committee. The report made me go in and look at our urban forestry policy and look at that, and there's a whole section about avoiding conflicts between trees and public sidewalks or right-of-ways in there. And there's one point I was curious if we'd ever done. There's one piece in there that says Public Works specifications will include removable sections of sidewalks to accommodate tree roots without having to replace an entire sidewalk panel. And I'm just curious if we do that very often and where we've done that, and it's get answer to that question.
A good question.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, the answer is yes, absolutely. The tool that we use are called tree rings. And essentially we take sort of cut out a scallop or a semicircle out of the sidewalk width, maybe reduce the width by a foot or something like that. Sometimes we'll do it immediately when we replace the sidewalk to avoid roots that have come up that we know would be very detrimental to cut. So we'll install that tree ring. Other times, what we will do is, as we put a panel in next to a tree, that there might be some expectation that in the near future it may grow enough so that the roots would start to impact the sidewalk. If you score that ring in there, you can go out later and knock it out as the tree grows rather than having to replace the whole panel. So you just have sort of a natural sort of way to knock it out to avoid that conflict. And eventually it may, still be too much, but it's a way to defer some of that. So yes, that is in there, and we've been doing that for many, many years.
Well, and I think tree grates, it rings a bell with everybody. We don't see a lot of those in residential areas with boulevards, however. Then there's another section the section that really concerned me. There's under that it says, there's a section about no tree shall be removed without written permission from the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. But then it says the contractor may remove all roots within an area defined as 6 1/2 inches below the top of the new finished sidewalk grade by severing them off cleanly with a sharp axe or by grinding them off using a root grinding machine instead of breaking them off with a backhoe or similar equipment. And that just calls out to me. We then said part of our policy is to allow them to cut everything away. We just heard today that even if you use a saw and a grinder, it's not much better than a backhoe, and it's a problem. So I know we've done workarounds on that already. There's actually a great example in the Second Ward of somebody who had an enormous elm tree that they'd preserved and it had made it through, and so we worked with Public Works and the Park Board. We went out there and they actually did a very small grade up on the sidewalk so that they didn't have to cut and grind the roots, and it was fantastic. So that we don't have to discuss that piece of the policy, but that's the part that kind of said, oh, finding this here makes me think maybe the policy should be changed a little. It seems like you're already doing this work, and I'm really excited to hear about the Forestry Preservation Coordinator position. But I'd like to move a staff direction, just asking Public Works to continue that work with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board Forestry Division, also with the Minneapolis Tree Advisory Committee and the Minneapolis Pedestrian Advisory Committee on a set of recommendations for changes to city policy and practice that will limit the impacts to trees from sidewalk repair work, and report back to Transportation and Public Works Committee no later than July 31st, 2014. And that's an arbitrary date that I just thought would give us plenty of time. But if there's a different, if that doesn't make any sense, you can let me know. But I think that might give us some time to develop some policy recommendations, especially if we have to change this policy itself, and we can hear that.
So, Assistant Director Hamilton, since the work is already identified as ongoing and happening, and all the parties that are referenced are actually already engaged, the key thing is actually the report back and the nature of the report back. Is it your notion that it should be specific to the ordinance?
The urban
or the guiding policy?
The guiding policy.
And so
Yes, I'm hopeful they'll have some recommendations for changes actually to the policy. I mean, it may be that there's more that comes back to it, so we can be open about that. But I do want to flag that. We could potentially flag that here, but when I say changes to city policy, that's the document I'm referring to.
Okay. So, and then those recommendations, of course, be driven by the data and, of course, the different interests that are reflected in the conversation by the parties identified. So the key thing is maybe the timeline is the only variable that's unknown, and if you could speak to that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, of course, we are doing this work already, so we're happy to come back and report back to committee. I think July 31st is fine. Whether we would be I imagine some of these conversations could be more prolonged than others because there are some different perspectives on this issue. But in any case, I think it would be fine for us to report back midsummer on where we are in terms of what changes we've made and perhaps what questions we're still thinking about, talking about, discussing.
And I guess I would, just as a by way of comment, I'd be very curious about what other additional data we would seek to complement this great, pretty comprehensive baseline. So that would be a great update as well.
Sure, Mr. Chair.
So I think we have, Councilmember Gordon has a motion for a staff directive. Any further discussion on that point? See none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, dissenting nay, that carries. Again, thank you everyone who's been involved in putting this data together, and the commitment to do it, I think is both definitely reflective in the various jurisdiction and departments, how important you take this asset. But here, it'll always be an interesting topic for us. Meet Minneapolis' new symbol has trees. When you fly into the city of Minneapolis, the most impressive thing you see is the tree canopy. It's stunning. And so, and of course, all the functional things that it does in terms of environmental impacts and aesthetics, et cetera. It's quite a package of how important it is, and its benefits are very layered. So we did very much look forward to that report and knowing that this will be an ongoing thing in terms of managing our assets. So thank you very much for the work. With that, we have concluded.
Mr. Chair?
Oh, yes, sir.
I'd also just like to move to receive and file the report.
Oh, thank you. Yes, the underlying motion to receive and file. Any further discussion on that? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting nay. Thank you.